My name is Drew Martin, and I'm Associate Professor of Systematic Theology here at Covenant Seminary. And the name of my book that I most recently wrote is The Covenant with Moses and the Kingdom of God, Thomas Hobbes and the Theology of the Old Covenant in Early Modern England. The book is about the covenant with Moses, which is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time. I've had an interest in covenant theology more generally since my own seminary days. And that's continued through a series of other different studies and on to the present time where I teach covenant theology here at the seminary. So I'm very interested in covenant theology, and the book in particular explores how the covenant with Moses relates to the covenant of grace. And this book is a historical study that tries to understand how the theologians during the period of the Westminster Assembly were wrestling with those topics, and also how they were wrestling with those topics in relation to their own social and cultural and political context. It's really helpful to understand not only the ideas, but also the context in which those ideas were developed and wrestled with. And when it comes to the covenant with Moses, in particular in the 17th century, conversations about political authority and the relationship between the church and the state, and a host of other very important political questions were always tied closely together with debates about covenant theology. And so it was fascinating to delve into those texts and to see those connections between theology and political questions, and to see the way in which sometimes that helped people to think better. Their theology helped them to think better about how they should conceive politics. But also we can see times where people's political views made it difficult for them to see the best understanding or the most helpful understanding of some of their theological ideas. And so writing the book not only helped me to understand the history of the period, but also was thought-provoking, because obviously theological and political questions continue to be relevant in our own day, and sometimes it's hard to relate those things. So working on this book allowed me to think not only about the context of the 17th century, but it also challenged me to think about how I live faithfully today. When it comes to the relevance today for some of the ideas in the book, there are several that come to mind, but perhaps maybe the first one to highlight would be that people continue to ask, to what extent and in what ways is the covenant with Moses still in force today? How does the covenant with Moses relate to the covenant of grace? Of course, we believe that the covenant of grace is something that has been in effect since the promises made to Adam and Eve after the fall. And at the same time, the administration of the covenant of grace has been different over time. And so one of the questions people have asked in relation to the covenant with Moses has to do with the fact that for Israel, the civil sphere and the, if you will, spiritual or ecclesiastical, if you will, sphere are closely connected. And so one question that arises has to do with whether or not that should still be a model for our politics today. And if not, why not? And so wrestling with the covenant with Moses was really helpful for thinking about that question, about the relationship between temporal and spiritual government. I wrote this book because I was interested in the topics, and in many ways, I think they are topics that are relevant to today. But in particular, I wrote this book to contribute to some academic conversations that have to do with the development of theology in the early modern period, and in particular as an attempt to develop some methodologies for putting theological and social, cultural, and political questions into conversations. One of the things that you notice when you read works of historical theology on the one hand, or works in the history of political thought on the other, is that very often these books are not in conversation with one another. And so you'll have brilliant works of political theory that tend to make generalizations about theology that aren't quite accurate. And at times, some of our brilliant works of historical theology also will talk about connections with politics that really are oversimplifications or need greater specificity or accuracy. And so one of the things I really enjoyed wrestling with is both fields and both disciplines and trying to put them in conversation with one another. And I wrote the book not only to study the ideas, but also to help me to grow and how to think about the development of theology in conversation with the context in which the theology was originally written. The book is written for an academic audience, so it really is in conversation with the guilds of historical theology and also the history of political thought. But also, I do think there are some chapters that will be interesting to non-specialists. Two chapters in particular treat the views of 7 different figures that were either divines at the Westminster Assembly or were closely involved in the conversations there. And so if you're interested in the theology of the Westminster Confession or figures like Samuel Rutherford or others like that, you would be interested in reading those chapters. And there's also in the introduction and conclusion some surveys of questions, and some of the treatment of those questions will be interesting to a broader audience. But it is true that the book is written for an academic audience, and so some of the book is pretty far into the weeds. So if you like that sort of thing, you'll like this book. If you don't like that sort of thing, you probably won't. When it comes to projects that I'm working on now, I continue to be interested in the topic of the kingdom of God and how our theology helps us to better understand what that is and how we inhabit it and how we anticipate it and how we live in light of what we believe. And so I was not only interested in how those ideas were developed in the 17th century, but for a variety of reasons have become interested in Francis Grimke, who was a pastor who grew up enslaved, a slave on a plantation outside of Charleston, and then was freed after the Civil War, ended up going to Princeton Seminary and pastored in Washington, D.C. for 50 years. And apart from the ministry of Francis Grimke, of course, the Lord could work through anyone. However, he chose to work through Francis Grimke to do a host of really amazing things. The formation of the NAACP is hard to explain apart from his ministry, just to give one example. And so it was really fun to work on this biography of Francis Grimke. And I'm excited for people to read it, especially because I think this book will be much more accessible to a broader audience. It'll be published with Crossway in their Theologians on the Christian Life series, and it should come out at the end of this year or early 2025. One of the things I love about teaching at Covenant Seminary is that this is a place where we can take theological questions seriously on their own terms and lean into those questions, and also wrestle with the original text of the scriptures and how the Bible should inform our theology. And at the same time, it's also a place where we are encouraged to think about our cultural moment and where we're living, and to take politics and society and culture seriously, and to try to ask how our theology might relate to these things in a way that does not collapse or oversimplify or avoid. And so I've enjoyed being in this place, especially because I'm writing books like this. It feels like this is a wonderful environment to have colleagues who are thinking about similar kinds of questions, but from other angles and in other disciplines. It's been an encouraging place to be.